So we're going to be looking at chapter 24 this morning. Be a real test of your memory since you had 2 weeks off. What can you remember from 3 weeks ago as we review chapter 23? Well, we'll go ahead and begin. This morning, I'm going to open up with a prayer. So, over the last couple of weeks of our study, we've been talking about Paul being arrested. And he was arrested. He was thrown into like a jail there in Jerusalem. They found out that there was a plot against him. So the commander, whose name was Lysias, shipped him off to Caesarea, which is where Paul is now. And Paul knew going into all of this when he came to Jerusalem that he was going to be imprisoned. So he understood that. I've got one for you here, Dory.
Thank you.
Yep. Do you need chapter 23? No. Okay, so 24 is there. So when he knew that he was going to be imprisoned, but obviously what has happened isn't quite like what he probably would have anticipated. Remember that the Lord appeared to him in chapter 23 and spoke to him and encouraged him. And so this morning I'd like to use a hymn from the Cross and Comfort section of the hymnal. Ladies that were in the ladies' meeting the last time might remember the author of this hymn. Not the last time, it might have been the time before. William Cooper, who had struggled with depression. He even tried to commit suicide a number of times in his life. But some of the hymns that he wrote were beautiful. And this is one, if you just reflect on the fact that this is a person who struggled with depression, and even with the question of whether his life was worth anything, listen to what he writes in here, and then also consider how it applies to the Apostle Paul and our own lives. God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. Deep in unfathomable minds of never-failing skill, he treasures up his bright designs and works his sovereign will. Ye fearful saints, fresh courage take. The clouds ye so much dread are big with mercy and shall break in blessings on your head. Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust him for his grace. Behind a frowning providence, he hides a smiling face. His purposes will ripen fast, unfolding every hour. The bud may have a bitter taste, but sweet will be the flower. Blind unbelief is sure to err and scan his works in vain. God is his own interpreter, and he will make it plain. Amen. All right, chapter 23. We're going to do the review sheet on the back of chapter 23 from a couple of weeks ago. Question number 1, who called for this trial of Paul by the Jews? The Roman commander. And I mentioned what was his name was? Lysias. Remember, we go through the whole chapter and we don't have his name mentioned. And we get to the very end, and when he writes the letter to Felix, his name is then included at that point. Number 2, what did Paul notice about the men gathered there?
They were divided.
In what way? They were divided.
Yeah.
Pharisees and Sadducees.
Very good. The two religious groups, so the Pharisees and the Sadducees, we're going to talk a little bit about those guys. What are the theological differences between these groups? There were 3 major ones that were mentioned by Luke in Luke 24, or Acts 23.
Sadducees didn't believe in resurrection.
Okay, resurrection?
No,
Angels and spirits. So the Sadducees rejected. No, there's other differences too, but these are the ones that he focused on. The Sadducees rejected the idea of spirits, angels, and denied the resurrection from the dead. So Paul he recognizes there's a difference between these guys, and he kind of accentuates the fact that he has been on trial for the resurrection in order to bring this divide between them. Okay, number 4. Vanessa, do you need chapter 23?
We have 23.
Okay. So question number 4. How did Paul use this to his advantage? Yeah, so he used that, he emphasized the fact that he was on trial for the resurrection in order to bring sort of a division between them so that they were not so much focused on him, but focused on each other, and it derailed, basically, the trial. Number 5, what did the Roman commander have to do, and why?
Protection, he takes them out, puts them in the barracks.
Okay, so he had to send the Roman soldiers in, and it says, do you remember how it was described? How is it described when he sent the Roman soldiers in? It said that it was...
And fearing lest Paul might be pulled to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force.
Keep going just a little bit. Is it in the next verse?
Among them and bring him to the barracks.
Okay, I was thinking that it said, maybe it's in the verse above, that was very difficult. He was concerned about Paul's life. They were going to tear him apart, it says. So he sent the Roman soldiers in there by force to bring him out. Number 6, so the why. So if you were one of my confirmation students, you'd get 2 points for this. And if you didn't answer the why, you'd only get 1 point. So there's 2 questions that are there. Why did they, or how did, what was involved in it, and why did he have to do that? So the why was, as Kayla read, he was afraid that he was going to get torn apart, that whether he was going to die or he was going to get abused. And remember, why do you think the Roman commander would be concerned about this?
Because he was a Roman citizen.
Because he was a Roman citizen. So what happened? If something bad happened to a Roman citizen who was on trial,
He gets killed.
yeah, he's going to be in trouble. So if anything happens to this Roman citizen under his protection, he's going to be the one who's going to be punished. All right, number 6. Why would the Lord have spoken to Paul at this point?
Just to reassure him that he would be okay and would be sent to Paul.
Yeah. Yeah, so again, part of this is this, when you think about Paul knowing that he was going to Jerusalem, knowing that he was going to be arrested, but probably had certain ideas of what that was going to look like. And this probably was not what he thought it was going to look like. And so it was to encourage him, I still have plans for you. I'm going to make sure that you're going to get to Rome, and I'm going to use you as a witness there also. So to encourage him along the way. Number 7, how is the hatred of Paul by the Jews seen next?
They take an oath to kill him.
Well, yeah, sort of. What was, there's something to do with killing him. What was it?
They were not going to eat or drink until they killed him.
Yeah, they formed a plot to kill him. And so there's this group of people, and you're right, they made an oath, a promise. We will not eat or drink until this guy is dead. This shows just how vile these individuals were, how dedicated they were to getting Paul removed and out of the way. So the next question then, who did they involve in their plan?
Chief priests and elders.
Yeah, they bring it to the religious leaders. They say, hey, we need some help with this. We need you to contact the Roman commander and ask him to be brought down. And then when he's brought out of the barracks to where we're going to meet, that's when we will fall on him and we will make sure that he dies. So they're involving then the Jewish council in their plans. Now, remember, for those of you who were here 3 weeks ago when we had this conversation, Deborah brought up, well, it doesn't actually say that they said that they would do that, which she's correct. I think the implication probably is that they would have been fine with requesting that. But Luke doesn't actually tell us that the Jewish council did reach out to the commander and say, hey, yeah, we want to set up this meeting and participate in what these 40 individuals were planning. Number 9, what would the proper response of God-fearing religious leaders have been to this plan? What should they have said?
Thou shalt not kill.
Yeah, they should have said, hey, this is not appropriate, this is not right, repent, so that should have been the response. Luke doesn't record that either. So not only does he not record the fact that they were involved, but he also doesn't record that they said, hey, that's not a good idea, this is contrary to God's law, let's not do this. Number 10, who discovers the plot? Remember, 2 points. Who discovers the plot? His nephew. And what does he do?
Goes to Paul.
Yes. So it's going to get to, well, not Felix, but it is going to get to Paul. He's going to come and tell Paul, and Paul is going to have one of the soldiers take the boy to the commander so that he shares that information with him. Good. All right, number 11. What does the Roman commander do with Paul?
Ships him off to Caesarea.
Yeah, now this is kind of interesting. He's going to send him off to Caesarea. There are two unique things about this. Go ahead.
During the night?
During the night. So he's concerned about doing it during the daytime. He's going to do it at night when they're not expecting it. What's the second thing?
200 soldiers?
Yeah, all of the soldiers. So you've got 200 soldiers, 200 spearmen, and 70 horsemen. So you're talking about 470 people going with one prisoner. So this kind of goes back to what we were talking about before. He doesn't want anything to happen to this Roman citizen. He's going to make sure that he is protected on his way to Caesarea. Good. Number 12, what is the final plan for Paul? This kind of comes out in the letter that Lysias writes. What's his goal?
Herod's Praetorium?
Yep.
Okay.
So, but what does Lysias want to see? Why is he sending him to Caesarea? Not just to get him out and to find protection for him. I mean, that's not the end of it, right?
To be heard.
Yeah, so they're going to have a trial up in Caesarea. His accusers from Jerusalem would need now to go to Caesarea in order to bring their charges against Paul. So this isn't the end of it. He's not just removing him from Jerusalem. That trial that was going to happen in Jerusalem is still going to happen, but it's going to happen in Caesarea. And then number 13, as we consider the events of this chapter, where and how do we see the hand of God? This one's worth 10 points. Just kidding. What do you have for thoughts?
Sending his son to Paul.
Okay. So that's that. There's a lot of things in this one chapter where we can see the hand of God. This kind of reminds me of the hymn that we started off with. God works in a mysterious way, His wonders to perform. Any others?
All the different times he protects Paul.
Okay, so there were times where Paul was going to get possibly torn apart, and God is protecting him. So sometimes it's in a very direct way. Sometimes it's in an indirect way, like with his nephew.
And the commander.
What about the commander?
Well, the commander that was looking out for him.
Okay, so he finds, now, it wasn't just because they had a really good relationship.
No, he himself.
Yes, he was. He was more concerned about himself. But that comes up because he finds out that Paul is a Roman citizen. So if we want to back up, that's a pretty important part in all of this too, isn't it? The fact that Paul has Roman citizenship is really important. And we've seen that in the past too, with Philippi, when they found out that he was a Roman citizen in Philippi. But Paul could have been dead if he had not had a Roman citizenship. And he said, I was born into this. This is the Lord's hand from years ago protecting Paul already. So that's a kind of a neat thing to see. Any others?
The Lord wanted him to be in Rome.
Okay.
The gospel. And he made that all happen through this.
Right. Yes, so Paul wanted to get to Rome. The Lord wanted Paul to get to Rome. He said, I'm going to make sure that you get to Rome. He's going to have a long journey between chapter 23 and when he finally gets to Rome yet. I mean, if you know the story and the history, this is not an easy travel that's going to take place. And I think that's part of the encouragement that the Lord gives to Paul here too. He's going to be in Caesarea for 2 years, waiting to be released, waiting to be heard. We're going to talk about that a little bit today in chapter 24. And then along the way, we move forward a little bit further, there's going to be storms and shipwrecks and all kinds of things that are going to take place that are going to sort of derail things, at least from a human perspective, but God is going to get him there. So God wanted him to get to Rome as a witness to the people. We'll get to that at the end of the book of Acts in the next couple of weeks. Any others? Pretty neat to see all of the different ways in which the Lord works in order to protect Paul, because he has a plan for him. And he's going to be moving in that direction to get Paul to Rome. Good. Any other thoughts just in general on chapter 23? All right, so chapter 24. Chapter 24 was where we're picking it up. So Paul is in Caesarea at this point. This chapter is going to be focused on basically Paul before the Roman governor Felix. So Kayla mentioned Felix just a little bit ago. Felix would have basically been the replacement for Pontius Pilate that we hear during the Lenten season. And there's a lot of connections between this chapter and what we see with Paul before Felix, and what we think of when we think of Jesus before Pontius Pilate. So Felix is the replacement for Pontius Pilate. Interestingly, those who were involved in the Lenten series this year, some of you know what happened to Pontius Pilate. He was recalled after the death of Jesus to Rome. We actually don't have any historical records of what happened, but there are implications that say that he was a disgraced individual and didn't serve again. Interestingly, the same thing happens to Felix. He seems like he's this prominent individual and governor. He was recalled 2 years after this trial with Paul back to Rome, and he was put down by the Roman governor also for, in fact, we still have in the historical records of the Romans the filing, if you will, the affidavit against Felix, and the fact that he was brought back for lack of duty, failure to do his duty in Judea. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind as you read through this, because he seems like he's a nice guy. He's spoken of very highly by the Jews in the beginning of this chapter, but that was just a little bit of rubbing their nose for Felix in order to get him on their side. So chapter 24 in Acts is where we're going to pick it up. Paul is in Caesarea. He's been brought there by the 470 armed men. And so now we're going to hear, Kayla also mentioned Herod's Praetorium. So just historically, remember that Caesarea was built by Herod the Great. So this would have been about 50 years earlier. He built this city, this port city on the shore of the Mediterranean, and he named it after Caesar in order to gain his favor. And it was a beautiful city. This was the capital city of Judea, the region where Israel was. And so Pilate, as well as Felix and all of the governors, generally would have resided in Caesarea. They would come to Jerusalem because it was the Jews' capital city, but the Romans had made Caesarea the capital city. So this is where the trial of Paul was going to take place. And I mentioned that the ruins of Herod's palace are still there in Caesarea today. So you can still see the foundation and part of the floor for the building that was there right on. So even the swimming pool that he had inside right out into the lake, the Mediterranean, is still there today. Pretty cool. All right, so chapter 24. Is there a volunteer to read for us in chapter 24? I will warn you, it might be a long section. But there aren't any difficult names.
I'll read.
Okay, go ahead, Linda.
Now after 5 days, Ananias, as the high priest, came down with the elders and a certain orator named Tertullus. These gave evidence to the governor against Paul. And when he was called upon, Tertullus began his accusation, saying, "Seeing that through you we enjoy great peace and prosperity is being brought to this nation by your foresight, we accepted always and in all places the most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. Nevertheless, not to be tedious to you any further, I beg you to hear by your courtesy a few words from us. For we have found this man a plague, a creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, and we seized him and wanted to judge him according to our law. But the commander Lysias came by with great violence, took him out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come to you. By examining him yourself, you may ascertain all these things of which we accuse him." And the Jews also assented, maintaining that these things were so.
Okay, let's stop there. So this is the first part of the chapter with the Jewish accusations against Paul. And so the Roman governor is Felix. The high priest is Ananias. We've talked a little bit about Ananias before. He was a underhanded, dirty, filthy scum of a guy. We have that in historical records too, even though he was the high priest. And that was one of the reasons why he was there for so long, is because he was accepting bribes and doing all kinds of things that he shouldn't have been doing. So Ananias isn't a good guy, but he comes down. He's the leader of the Jews from a religious perspective, and he's going to be the one who's going to be representing the Jewish leaders. But they have a lawyer, Tertullus. We don't know anything about him, whether he's got a Greek name. It's not a Jewish name. But they bring him along, and he's going to be the one pleading the case on behalf of the Jewish people against Paul. Now, this is where we have to think a little bit about, this is where the connection is between Paul and his trial and Jesus' trial 30 years earlier. What did the Jews accuse Jesus of? Blasphemy. What kind of a crime was that? Yes, it did carry a death sentence, but what type of a... It was a religious crime. Okay? So when they bring Jesus, after finding him guilty at 2 separate trials, one before Annas and one before Caiaphas, they bring Jesus to Pontius Pilate, and they do not bring the charge of blasphemy. What was the charge that they bring against Jesus to Pilate?
He called himself a king.
Okay, so is that a religious crime? No. It's a secular crime. And notice, if you think about the whole history of the Gospels and the harmony that we read, anyone who makes himself out to be an enemy of Caesar is not Caesar's friend. So all of this stuff, if he's a king, then you're not supporting Caesar. So they wanted to make it into a secular crime. They charged him with being a usurper of Roman authority, somebody who was rebellious or an insurrectionist. These were all the things that they were charging Jesus with. And even though Pilate knew that Jesus was innocent, he found him guilty because of the pressure. So I want you to pay attention again as we're reading through this, that the charges that are brought against Paul are just like the charges that were brought against Jesus. They aren't religious crimes. They're political crimes. So let's work our way through some of the things that he mentioned. So at first, you'll kind of notice what we used to call brown nosing. At the very beginning, this was sort of something that was expected when you stood before somebody who was very authoritative, had a lot of power. He says in verse 2, "Since we have through you attained much peace, and since by your providence reforms are now being carried out for this nation, we acknowledge this in every way and everywhere, most excellent Felix, with all thankfulness." So he's really trying to lay it on thick with Felix and say, hey, we really appreciate all the things. And remember, historically we're told this guy was a failure. So most likely this is all garbage. Whatever it is that he's saying about Felix wasn't true at all, but he was trying to at least, what? What's he trying to? He's trying to get to his ego, right? You're a great guy. And make him say, yep, you're going to be on our side. All right, so we acknowledge all of this. He says, I don't want to worry you any further, verse 4, but hear us out. Verse 5. We have found this man to be, what was the word that you had there, Linda, in verse 5?
Plague.
A plague. Some translations have troublemaker, pest, a plague. What's wrong with a plague?
Doesn't go away.
Okay, it doesn't go away. It's dangerous, right? It spreads. This is a plight to humanity. So this is this is not a religious thing. This is a political thing. This guy is sowing seeds that are going to affect our nation, the peace of our nation. So he's a plague. He's a fellow who stirs up dissension among us. I think that's where we had troublemaker. What did you have in there, Linda?
Creator of dissension.
Creator of dissension. What does NIV have?
Troublemaker.
That's where the troublemaker comes in, okay. Stirring up riots. Okay, so again, notice political. He's trying to drive the people away from Roman law, Roman rule, peace. So he's creating trouble. Not just religious trouble, but secular trouble. Going on, he says, not just in Judea or in Jerusalem, but throughout the world. So this has a long spanning problem. It's not just in Jerusalem. What you just saw here, this is bigger than that. He does this throughout the world. He had been throughout the world. And there have been problems throughout the world. We're going to come back to that in just a little bit. And then it says, the last one at the very end. Linda, what did you have at the very end of verse 5?
All the Jews throughout the world and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarene.
Okay, a ringleader. So this is a chief, a chieftain, somebody who's in charge of the sect of the Nazarenes. Now this is very important also. What's Nazarenes have to do with things?
Jesus.
Yes, that's where Jesus was from. Okay, so they're using this to describe Jesus, the Nazarenes, the sect of the Nazarenes. Sect is a very important word. And again, now this might sound like it's religious in nature. It's not. What we have to understand is that there were some religions in Rome that had been approved to be practiced. But there were also many that were not. There were illegal religions. What they were trying to do is they were trying to claim that Paul was a ringleader, a leader of an illegal religion that was not approved under Roman law. So again, a secular law, not a religious one, politically connected. So these things that we're going to take a look at, what he's being charged with, they're being very, very careful to make sure that these are secular in nature, political in nature, and not religious in nature, because Felix is going to throw it out if it's religious in nature. He doesn't want to hear it if it has something to do with religion. So even though they include the fact that it is religious in nature, they're making the claim that it should not be allowed, and it's a sin against the state, if you will, because it is an illegal religion. It is not the Jewish religion. This is a spin-off, and it should not be allowed. All right, and then he goes on in verse 6. This is where he brings in a couple of other ones, that this is where they're trying to prove that this was a spin-off, that it was an illegal religion. He says he tried to desecrate our temple, so he's certainly not Jewish if he's trying to desecrate the temple. And when we arrested him, when we arrested him, we wanted to judge him according to our own law. He says, we wanted to do this ourselves, and that's what we were trying to do. Now, most of your Bibles might have either a footnote, so I'm guessing maybe the NIV doesn't even include those verses. Is that correct? So you have a note that goes to the bottom that tells you that there are a couple of extra verses that are found in some Greek manuscripts. If you have New King James or King James, it's going to be in the text, but you might have brackets around it that takes you to the bottom that says these verses aren't found in all Greek manuscripts. So there's a second argument to all of this, and that is that the Jews were saying, we thought we should be able to judge him on our own, but the commander, he stepped into our business and got himself involved in something that he shouldn't have. Now here's the interesting thing about this second argument, is that the second argument actually undermines the first argument, doesn't it? Because the only thing that they would have been able to handle on their own would have been a religious dispute. And so in essence what they're doing, and I think this might be why some of the Greek manuscripts have eliminated this out, because a lawyer who knows what he's talking about probably would not have undermined his first argument by including the second argument. So this is just one of those things. Now again, they might have had some other reasons for doing this. They said, hey, this guy took him away. We should be able to judge him ourselves. We want to take him back to Jerusalem. You can see where they're trying to go with that. It's a second argument. All right. So any thoughts so far with verses 1 through 9? Any questions? So this kind of, keep in mind we're talking about the fact that he's been charged with secular crimes, political crimes, not religious crimes. We're going to see Paul's defense. Now here's the other thing that's a nice parallel. Nice is probably not the best word. A parallel though between Paul and Jesus. When Jesus was accused before both the Jewish leaders and Pontius Pilate, what do the Gospels tell us?
He said nothing.
Okay, he said nothing. Why did he say nothing? What do we hear about the people that are accusing him? Do you remember? Yeah, they were false witnesses. So the reason that Jesus didn't need to say anything is because there was no truth to it. So we're going to hear now these things that we've just heard from Tertullus. There's some truth to it. Paul has been all over the world. He was in the temple. But what they have done is they have lied about what Paul's purpose was. Paul, nowhere where he had been, in Ephesus, in Philippi, any of these places where there has been trouble, in Derbe and Lystra and Iconium, Paul didn't start any of that. He didn't start throwing stones. He wasn't calling people names. They started it, and they said it was his fault because he was talking about Jesus. So once again, you'll see how they're lying. They're false witnesses about what has been taking place. And Paul is going to bring that up in his own defense in just a little bit. All right, so any thoughts? 1 to 9? Okay, Linda, do you want to go on? Pick it up, verse 10?
Then Paul, after the governor had nodded to him to speak, answered, Inasmuch as I know you have been for many years the judge of this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself, because you may ascertain that it is no more than 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to worship. And they neither found me in the temple disputing with anyone, nor inciting the crowd, either in the synagogues or in the city, nor can they prove the things of which they now accuse me. But this I confess to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, so I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets. I have hope in God, which they themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. This being so, I myself always strive to have a conscience without offense toward God and men. Now after many years I came to bring alms and offerings to my nation, in the midst of which some Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with a mob nor with a tumult. They ought to have been here before you to object if they had anything against me, or else let those who are here themselves say if they found any wrongdoing in me while I stood before the council, unless it is for this one statement which I cried out, standing among them. Concerning the resurrection of the dead, I am being judged by you this day.
All right, let's stop there. All right, so here's Paul's defense to Felix in front of the Jewish leaders. And notice how he emphasizes Paul would have been a pretty good lawyer. He understands the accusations that have been leveled against him, and he deals with each one of them. So in verse 10, first of all, I think verse 10 is really important to notice also. What had Tertullus done when he started his speech to Felix? Okay, he had brown-nosed. Notice what Paul does. What does Paul do in verse 10 when he begins his presentation to Felix? Well, yeah, but he doesn't make false claims though, right? He does say, hey, you are honorable. You are to be respected because of the position that you hold. But he doesn't make any false claims or try to butter him up at all. He's just respecting the individual who's in authority. So a very interesting dynamic, a difference between Tertullus and Paul. And his is very short. He says, yep, you've been a judge here for a while. You are to be respected. But then he goes on in making his defense. He says, well, okay, first of all, yes, I have been in Jerusalem, but regarding any claims against me, I came up to the temple, and he says, you know where I've been ever since then, because I've been in custody. So I haven't done anything outside of just this one event coming to Jerusalem. So he points out, hey, they can't make a whole lot of claims to me about what I have done in the last 2 weeks, because I've been in prison for most of it. Everybody's been knowing where I am. Verse 12, now this is where he clears up some of the false accusations that the Jews have made against him. Neither in the temple, which is where he was found, nor in the synagogues, nor in the city did they find me carrying on a discussion with anyone or causing a riot. In other words, Paul says, I've been in Jerusalem for a little bit. Remember when he came to Jerusalem, he met with the Christians, the leaders of the Christian church. He visited with them. They discussed the work in Jerusalem and the work throughout the world. So he has been there and he's been having discussions, but it's been private and it's been within Christian circles. He says, you will find no evidence that I have been out trying to stir up the Jews, which maybe the claim could have been made on his foreign travels, that he would go to the synagogue and he would have discussions and debates there. But not since he's been in Jerusalem. He says, I haven't done that. He knew, remember, coming to Jerusalem, he had to keep clean because he knew that there were going to be some issues. So he didn't try to push any buttons when he was in Jerusalem. He says, no, I was not having any discussions and I was not stirring up any trouble anywhere in Jerusalem since I have been here. And then he says, and they can't prove anything. He says, have you listened? They've made a lot of accusations, but they have no witnesses. In fact, he says, the guys who started the issue in Jerusalem in the temple, they're not even here. They should be here in order to state what happened, but they're not. So he makes the claim, nope, there is no evidence to anything that they have said. That's in verse 13. Now, he's going to address the issue of the sect of the Nazarenes. Verse 14. I admit to you that according to the way, what have we learned about the phrase the way? That's referring to Christianity. According to the way, which they call a sect, I do serve the God of our fathers, believing everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written with the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men also cherish, that there shall certainly be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. So he takes this claim that that Christianity is a sect which is illegal under Roman law, and flips it around and says, actually, Christianity is the continuation of the law that you have approved and which is legal, and in reality the religion that they are practicing is the one that should be illegal, if you want to look at it from that perspective. So if you're going to make a religious claim base, he says what Christianity is, the religion of the way, is the continuing on of the prophets. He says there's things that we share. We both have a desire to see God, a desire about God. There are some similarities there, but it is Judaism that is a departure from the religion of the Old Testament. So again, he deals with the issue of Christianity being a sect that is illegal under Roman law. And then at the very end of verse 15, this is a little bit of a call to repentance, both for Felix as well as for the Jewish leaders and those who were there charging Paul at this trial. They knew that, at least the majority of them would have known, that what they were claiming was false. And so Paul brings out at the very end, he says, at the resurrection, there is going to be a judgment. There is going to be a judgment of the righteous and the wicked. And so he's being very careful. He's not calling them out necessarily, but he is reminding them at the end, there is going to be a judgment in which God judges the hearts of all men. So, and then there's a couple of other things that he does in the next couple of verses where he defends what is going on. And these are helpful because remember, he has been charged with starting a riot in the temple and bringing in, remember, a Gentile into the temple, which is what caused everything. So verses 16 and following, he's giving some background information that explain why he was in the temple and what he was doing. So in verse 16, he says, I've done my best to maintain a blameless conscience both before God and before men. Now his conscience, when he was on his missionary journeys, led him to defend the truth of Christ to Jews, even in the synagogue. That was part of his conscience. Now he had not done that in Jerusalem, but what he's pointing out here is that my conscience would forbid me from doing what they have said that I did in the temple, to start a riot in the temple. That's not appropriate. Remember, he's saying it's Christianity that holds on to these things that are connected to the temple. And so he could not do what he is charged with because he views the religion that he is a follower of as being the right religion. And then he says in verse 17, now after several years I came to bring alms. What do you have there, verse 17? Anybody have anything different from alms?
Offerings.
Offerings, okay. So a couple different words that you might find there. To my nation and to present offerings, in which they found me occupied in the temple. Remember what it was that had driven Paul to come back to Jerusalem? We talked a little bit about this in a couple of places in Acts, especially when we looked at other passages from the letters that Paul wrote. What had he done when he was on his last missionary journey that was so important for him to get back? He had collected offerings from the believers of those churches. For what purpose? Do you remember what the purpose was?
Give to the poor.
Yeah, well, sort of, yes. But there was a specific purpose. There was something else that had taken place that caused the poverty. It was a famine. So there was a famine in Jerusalem and in the area around it. So he had collected these offerings from the fellow believers throughout all of these places that he was traveling. He was bringing this offering back in order to give it to the poor in Jerusalem, those who were needy in Jerusalem. So his point is here, I didn't come back to Jerusalem in order to cause a riot. I came back to Jerusalem because I care about the people in Jerusalem, and I was bringing this offering, this collection that I had taken, in order to help the people of Jerusalem. And then he says, do you think that it would make sense for me, having a whole bunch of, probably a lot of money, to start a riot? Does that make any sense whatsoever? That doesn't make any sense at all, does it? So he's again showing why he had come back to Jerusalem, and he wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't a ringleader, that he was trying to cause dissension or insurrection. He was one who cared about people, and he was among people who cared about people, and they were supporting this work by sending this offering to the people in Jerusalem. So he said, verse 18, this is where they found me, occupied in the temple doing this, bringing this offering. Some of that offering would have come to the Lord also. There would have been the believers throughout all of these different churches that may have sent. This happened to me when I was a missionary, where people knew that I was going overseas. And so, some of you will give money to like the Mission Development Fund, MDF. When I was serving overseas, a lot of times I would have members that would say, hey, you're going over there. Can I give you $100 to use for whatever you think is the most important need over there? So they would just, so you have people that would just give you that money, and then you could put it to use directly instead of sending it to the MDF and then get in it, so all of that. And that's sort of what Paul is talking about here too, that there were some Christians that said, hey, we want to send some money back for the church in Jerusalem, to support the church in Jerusalem. Can we send that back with you? Not just for the famine, that would be more like kinship, but for the actual work of the church there too. So he had two different things: the alms, that would be for the poor, and the offerings, that would have been for the work of the church. And he says, that was the reason that I came back, was to bring this money to support the work of the church here in Jerusalem. And then at the very end, he says, there were these people, the people that followed me from Asia, the Jews there, and he says they should be here to bring charges against me if they're going to make these charges. But he says they're not here. They don't have anything against me. And then he gets at the very end, verse 21, he brings up again the resurrection of the dead. He says that really what this is all about is the charge that I mentioned when he was in Jerusalem, that I am on trial today for the resurrection of the dead. That was the difference between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So thoughts on 10 through 21, Paul's defense.
So what was the cause of the commotion in Jerusalem? If he just brought money, that didn't cause commotion. What did?
It was the guys from Asia that saw Paul there. So we don't know exactly what was going on in the heart. But remember, they claimed they saw also, do you remember who the young man, or the man who was with Paul? Trophimus. So he had a young man that had come with him from Asia, and the people, when they got to Jerusalem, they recognized this young man who was a Greek. And they assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Now, whether they assumed or whether they made up a lie, again, we don't know for sure, and it might have been a little bit of both. But that was the cause of the dissension in Jerusalem, Linda, was the fact that these Jews had seen Paul in Jerusalem. They assumed that he had brought in this Greek into the temple to desecrate the temple or to defile the temple. And that's what caused the uproar, that he was undermining the Jewish law by teaching, rejecting circumcision, rejecting the eating of certain meats, etc. And then this whole thing with Trophimus the Greek. Okay, any other thoughts? All right, let's read through the last section, 22 to the end. Linda, do you mind keep going?
But when Felix heard these things, having more accurate knowledge of the way, he adjourned the proceedings and said, when Lysias the commander comes down, I will make a decision on your case. So he commanded the centurion to keep Paul and to let him have liberty, and told him not to forbid any of his friends to provide for or visit him. And after some days, when Felix came with his wife, Drusilla, who was Jewish, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Jesus. Now as he reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and answered, go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I will call for you. Meanwhile, he also hoped that money would be given him by Paul, that he might release him. Therefore, he sent for him more often and conversed with him. But after 2 years, Porcius Festus succeeded Felix, and Felix, wanting to do the Jews a favor, left Paul bound.
All right, so that takes us to the end of the chapter. So we're told that Felix, again, this kind of gives us a little bit of an idea of Felix's mentality, the type of person that he was. He said, well, we'll get Lysias up here and we'll hear his side of it. Well, Lysias never makes it up. It's not like he couldn't have, but he doesn't want this proceeding to be concluded. And why? What do we read in here that was at least part of the reason why Felix didn't want to see the hearings come to a conclusion?
Trying to please the Jews.
Okay, part of it is he wants to please the Jews. That's why he left Paul in prison when he was recalled to Rome and Festus takes over. But there was another reason.
Paul was going to pay him.
He wanted a bribe.
Yeah.
Now, I want you to think about this a little bit. Remember what Paul's defense included. It included bringing money from these people. And so you can imagine when Felix hears this, the wheels start turning. He's like, this guy's wealthy. He's got wealthy friends. All I need to do is hold him here, and he's going to want to get out, and his friends are going to want him out, and he'll offer to pay me a bribe, which was very common in those days. And so he wanted, and here's the thing. So it tells us in, what verse is that? Verse 22. Verse 22 says, Felix, having a more exact knowledge about the way. So that's Christianity, right? Why did he have a more exact knowledge of the way? Because his wife was Jewish. So he would have been familiar with the ways of the Jews. He would have been familiar with some of these different groups connected to Judaism because his wife was familiar with those things. But and we're told in verse 25 that when Paul would preach to him, he wasn't very happy. He said, go away, I don't want to hear it, because he talked about what? Righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. He was preaching the law to Felix, and Felix didn't want to hear the law. He says, I'll hear about you, but he did want a bribe. So he would bring him back in, and he would ask him questions, hoping that Paul would say, hey, if you let me out, I'll slip you a little bit in order to get a good decision. Paul wasn't going to do that. So we'll hear what happens then when Festus takes over in chapter 5 next week. But Felix was recalled to Rome. He did not do a very good job. And we're going to hear about Festus and his relationship with Paul in the next chapter. Any thoughts? Questions? If we keep on pace, we should be done by May 5th. May 12th is confirmation, so we won't have examination that morning, no Bible class that week, which would give us May 19th is our last week for Bible class and Sunday school, and that would give us an opportunity to do any review of the book of Acts on the 19th. So that's kind of the plan going forward, one chapter a week, and then a review on the 19th. So, any thoughts before we close? Let's close then with the blessing of our Lord. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you now and always. Amen.